Hello, everyone. We're ready to start again with yet another distinguished panel on a vital topic confronting liberal democracy today. My name is Tom Shull, and I'm Survey Research Director for the Institute for the Study of Modern Authoritarianism, which is hosting this conference. I'm also Editor-at-Large at the unpopulous Chickadalmia Substack. I don't mean to read the teleprompter cues, but I'm going to say that again. Chickadalmia Substack, the unpopulist. Pause here for applause. Our previous panel addressed the question of post-liberal critiques of liberal democracy. And as a byproduct of those critiques, it's become increasingly common to read that our system of government is broken. There are many reasons for this, I think. Exhibit A is Congress. But most recently and painfully, excruciatingly, it's been the state of the U.S. presidential race. There's a serious concern that our process of nominating and electing people to government office is not working well. This brings us to the subject of our next panel discussion, which is on electoral systems for a diverse liberal democracy. This is a great panel. Joining us today are John Carey. John is the John Wentworth Professor in the Social Sciences at Dartmouth College and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is the author or co-author of 6 books, including 2 on term limits and legislators, 2 on executive power, and another on legislative accountability, as well as the author of over 100 academic articles on representation and democracy. In addition, he is co-founder and director of BrightlineWatch.org, which publishes, among other reports, surveys of the American public and political scientists to monitor the state of democratic practices, norms, and institutions in the United States. John has consulted on electoral reform in more than a dozen countries, including Canada, Afghanistan, Yemen, Israel, Mexico, and Taiwan. Also joining us is Tova Wang. Tova is Director of Research Projects in Democratic Process at the Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation, which has been cited as among the best university-affiliated think tanks in the world. She has consulted for international organizations on electoral and constitutional reform worldwide, and she recently served as Director of Policy and Research at the Center for Secure and Modern Elections, where she worked on voter registration reform and oversaw and conducted research on increasing political participation among marginalized groups. Tova has produced major studies on increasing voter participation rates among low-income people, communities of color, naturalized immigrants, women, and Native Americans. These studies have included her critically acclaimed book, The Politics of Voter Suppression: Defending and Expanding Americans' Right to Vote. Our next panelist was scheduled to be Lee Drutman, who was unable to join us today, having come down with COVID. Fortunately, Drew Penrose was able to join us in his place. Drew is a policy strategist, researcher, and advocate at Protect Democracy, a cross-ideological nonprofit dedicated to protecting liberal democracy, challenging authoritarian threats, and building a more resilient democratic institution in the United States. And by the way, remember that name, Protect Democracy. We'll be coming back to it in a moment. Drew has more than a decade of experience in electoral reform, including a prior leadership role at the nonpartisan organization Fair Vote, where he led efforts for ranked choice voting and proportional representation, in which legislators are elected to office in proportion to the number of votes their party receives. Drew is author or co-author of numerous articles and reports in this field, including studies on the presidential recount system, ranked choice voting, and strategic litigation in state courts to advance electoral reform. Our moderator for this discussion is Ian Bassin. Ian is co-founder and executive director of Protect Democracy, the organization I mentioned just a moment ago. Ian previously served as Associate White House Counsel in the Obama administration, where he advised the president and senior White House staff on administrative and constitutional law, and ensured the White House and executive branch officials complied with the fundamental laws, rules, and norms that protect democratic government. He has repeatedly been named among the 500 most influential people in Washington, D.C. by Washingtonian Magazine, and his writing on democracy, authoritarianism, and American law and politics has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Atlantic, Slate, Salon, and other publications. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Ian.
Thank you, Tom. Well, that's generous. We haven't even started yet. So let's start with a tale of two elections. This month, we had an election in France in which the National Front, National Rally, won the most votes, 37% of overall votes, but placed third in terms of seats in the legislature. We had another election in the UK in which the Labour Party won about a third of overall votes, but ended up with 2/3 of the seats in the legislature. Drew and my colleague Sohini Desai wrote recently in our If You Can Keep It newsletter that created sort of a funhouse mirror effect of democracy in which what was fat looked skinny, what was tall looked short. Notice what I just did there. I plugged ifyoucankeepit.org. I run an organization. I'm not going to get on stage and not plug ifyoucankeepit.org, which is where we talk about these things, so please do sign up there. But these wildly different results in these two elections just demonstrate how the systems that we choose to translate popular will into governing power can vary wildly and produce incredibly different results. Some that you might favor, some you might not. And the question we want to tackle is, as liberals, are there choices that we should make in how we structure our electoral systems that are preferable for preserving liberalism? And so to start that conversation, John, I want to start with you, just to give us a bit of a taxonomy here of all of the options across the world where so many different countries do this differently. If all of us are liberals and we sit down for the meal and we get a menu to choose from, what's on the menu? And be our waiter here and help us understand the menu and maybe what the specials are.
Excellent. Yeah, I'd be happy to. So first I'll say I'm going to be talking about the way we elect legislatures. These are, collective bodies, as opposed to about half of the democracies out there elect presidents as well. And that is, by definition, it's a single office. There aren't any collective presidencies around these days. So the set of options for electing presidents is smaller if we just look. So I'm going to start broad and think about legislatures, because every democracy elects one, and they're by definition collective. And so let's think about three families of ways to go about doing that. And the first one is what I'll call single winner systems. Okay, so these are systems where the country's cut up into mutually exclusive geographical districts, and every district elects a single representative. That's what we do in this country. So that's one set. Then there's going to be multi-winner systems, and then there are going to be mixed systems. So let me talk about the variance within each of those. Okay. So if we think about single winner systems, you talked about two right off the bat. The first type, the type that we use in this country, the UK uses, Canada uses, India prominently uses, are single winner plurality systems. So it's just one round of elections. Whoever runs, whoever gets the most votes wins the representation in that district. And so you can end up with these results, especially in a fragmented field like they had in the UK this year, where a party well short of majority of votes ends up with a supermajority of seats. Okay, so if we think about, we might be a little uneasy with that. One of the responses to that has been two-round systems. Also, this is still within the single winner category. France has the two-round system. And the intuition behind that is, well, we want to make sure that whoever comes out of this contest has got a substantial amount of support. We don't want to run the risk of a fragmented field leading to a winner with a small share of the vote. So two-round system, France's is a little unusual, actually, because the threshold for advancing to the second round is only 12.5% of the vote. That's very low. Most two-round systems would say just the top two go through, and then one of them is going to end up with a majority in a second-round vote. And again, France is a variant, but the intuition is the same. And then the third prominent type within that single winner category is what we'll call ranked choice voting, or sequential elimination that all takes place in a single round. So as a voter, you rank order your ballot, and then we eliminate candidates sequentially from that. We're still trying to get to a winner with broad, maybe majority support. Okay, so that's the three types within the single winner systems. But most democracies around the world use multiple winner systems. Okay, and so I'm going to talk about two broad categories within that. One of them is the most common, sort of the most common way to elect legislatures in democracies is by list proportional representation. And the basic intuition there is parties run lists of candidates, voters cast a preference. Their primary preference is for the party. If you get into the weeds, we can talk about also indicating preferences among candidates within the list. But the main thing is you cast a preference for a party, and then the first thing that happens when votes get counted is that seats get allocated to those parties within the district according to their proportion of the vote. Okay? That's proportional representation. The second type within that multi-winner system is also ranked choice voting. But when we do ranked choice voting in a multiple winner system, we call it, or political scientists tend to call it, single transferable vote. And it's pretty rare. Ireland is maybe the country that's used it longest and has been democracy for a long time, and it's a prominent case. Australia uses it for its Senate. There's a couple other examples. But it punches above its weight in reformist circles. It's because a lot of people really like the principle that instead of voting for a party list, you get to rank order your preference across all the candidates, and then there's a mechanism for allocating seats in a multi-winner district. That kind of rank order voting in multi-winner districts can end up giving representation that looks a lot like proportional representation, but the mechanics of it are pretty different. Okay, so those are the multi-winner systems, and the last category I'll talk about is mixed systems. Now, that just is layering a multi-winner system on top of a single winner system. But here's the distinction. It's not the case that, there's two chambers of the legislature and one uses one and one uses the other. And when I talk about a mixed system, I'm talking about within the same chamber of a legislature, you have single winner contests going on. And then on top of that geographical map with a bunch of single member districts, you layer a proportional system. And there's two main variants within these mixed systems. One of them, those two types of elections take place independently from each other. And so the winners in the single member districts go off to the legislature. The winners in the PR tier, they all go off to the legislature, and that's your chamber. So we'll call that a parallel system because the two elections take place in parallel. And those would be, Japan would be a prominent example, Mexico would be another prominent example there. And then the other main type of mixed system is what we call compensatory. Okay, so in that case, you have the single winner contests going on. The thing about single winner contests is they tend to give a huge bonus to the winning party, to the biggest party, even if it's not a majority party, like in the UK's recent election. And so what they do in the proportional tier is they actively try to compensate for that winner's bonus. They allocate the proportional seats, not strictly proportionally to the proportional vote, but to offset disproportionalities at the lower tier. And the most prominent case of this is Germany, although there are a bunch of other cases around the world that do it as well. And in the 90s and aughts, a lot of countries adopted these mixed systems as a way to try to mitigate the sort of the problems with both single winner and multi-winner systems. That's the tier of options as we look around the world. And I'll stop because I have a tendency to go on at great length.
So Drew, John has kindly come over to our table and told us what's on the menu, and so I'm now the United States, and I say, oh, okay, well, I'll take that single member winner take all plurality district, and I'm reminded of there's a great 1980s movie called L.A. Story with Steve Martin, and he orders, he's in the restaurant and he says, "I'll have the duck," and the waiter goes, "The duck? You want the duck?" And so, Drew, I just ordered the duck, and I want you to tell me, you want the duck? You don't think we've made a good choice here? Why do you think that we've made a poor choice, and what's your best argument for why we've made the wrong choice and maybe want to choose a different system?
Thanks. Yeah. So we heard the phrase "politics is broken." It's so common it's become kind of a cliche. But in many ways, the single member system has always been a kind of awkward fit for the United States. If you go all the way back to the founding, they did not have this menu. The menu literally did not exist at the time. Most of the systems that were just described had not yet been invented. So we inherited essentially the system that was used in the English countryside at the time. But if you look at the statements of the founders as to what they were trying to achieve, you can find John Adams writing that the legislature should be a portrait in miniature of the people at large, should think, feel, and reason like them. Or if you read Federalist 10 by Madison, stating that the way we manage the violence of factionalism is by allowing more factions in, by allowing a greater diversity of viewpoints to be expressed so that no one can oppress all of the others with a majority. These are statements that make a clear preference for a proportional system. They sound like a call for proportional representation. I think there's a very clear case to be made that the founders would have instituted a proportional system had such a thing been available to them at the time. And the concerns about factionalism that they had then, I mean, they had no idea what was in store for the United States. It was a much smaller slice of a much smaller pie at that time. Today, with the kind of diversity of interests and identities that we have and the kind of existential threats of oppression that we have, there's a much stronger case, I think, to be made for a proportional system than there was at that time. Yet we're still using today the same system inherited from the English countryside, and that has resulted in a number of consequences. It is a choice, and that choice has consequences. We have the whole problem of gerrymandering. Something like 90% of districts are not competitive. We have disproportionate representation of older, whiter, male representatives at a time when more voices should be heard and should be giving their perspectives. And this is not inevitable. We could adopt a proportional system just by a statute. It actually would not require changing the Constitution, just adopting multi-member districts within the states and any number of proportional systems available to us within those states. And the result would be that you'd have Republicans from cities being elected, Democrats from the countryside being elected. Those voices are there. They're just suppressed right now. We would have a fairer reflection on race and gender in our representation than we have today. Every election would be competitive. And gerrymandering basically disappears overnight when representation isn't based on districts. Then gerrymandering ceases to be a tool that is usable. So I think the arguments for proportional representation in the United States are pretty clear. I think the case is pretty clear. The system that we have today is completely unfit for the kinds of challenges that we have. It worked in the sense that it was relatively stable for a long time, but as factionalism has become the far more salient thing, just as it was perhaps for the founding generation, we find that it is not meeting the needs. And if we want to move forward with the democracy of tomorrow, which is the name of my team at Protect Democracy, I think proportional representation, some form of proportional representation is the way to go.
Now, Tova, Drew started to allude a little bit to this, but whenever you start talking about changing the potential system by which you are translating popular will into governing power, the question starts to arise of what impact might that have on participation, and will that impact be equally distributed, or will it affect different demographic groups in different ways? And so you've researched this, and would like to ask you to talk a little bit about what you see as the potential impact on those ways. And as you and I noted, even before coming up here, we have a challenge of, we're going to talk about representation through a political system on a panel that probably could use even more representation on it. So we got to navigate, those two dynamics. But I also want to ask about whether if you were striving for the greatest amount of sort of inclusion representation of the diverse voices in the country, what systems might you choose among those options on the menu?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for acknowledging the oddity of the lack of diversity on this panel as well. I think PR may be it. I'm not quite sure. I am kind of in a position of leaving the different permutations of what that might look like, the people who have gone into further detail on that. I think that there are studies that show that PR is better for marginalized communities, people of color, and is somewhat better in redistribution. But I sort of come at the question of maybe we back up and try and figure out what are the values that we're trying to support when we're looking at reforming a system or overhauling a system. I think it has to be one that we're striving not just for tolerating or allowing for a multiracial America, but actually supporting and facilitating it. And there is an argument that PR does that, so I feel open to certainly looking at that further. But I think we need to incorporate that lens. I would also say, is there a system in which we do more to address economic inequality? So is there a system that shifts power from people who are lower income away from the corporate powers that seem to have mostly captured our politics? I don't know the answer to that, but I come at it with those values to begin with. I would also mention, sort of outside of this perhaps, but the need for a strong labor movement in this country for any system to work well, for a number of reasons I can get into. And, I'll just mention, I think that there are probably people at this point, I know this is sort of whispered sometimes about whether increasing turnout is actually a way to go for liberalism, considering, things that have happened when we've had high turnout. This is what I've worked on my whole life. I have to, and I do, assume that this is a predicate for any system that we adopt, that we must have a system that has full access, that supports full access, and leaves no one out in order to even have the foundation for a liberal democracy before you start talking about various structures. So there's a great argument for PR. I'm basically persuaded, but I think that perhaps we should look more at the values that we're trying to promote and think creatively and expansively about it.
Now, when people make arguments, as we're starting to hear made on this panel, in favor of a more proportional system, John, one of the things that gets raised is if you look across the world today, you are seeing a rise in illiberalism, a rise in authoritarian politics in countries with very different systems. It's not as if proportional representation countries are immune to the rise of authoritarianism or illiberalism. So, you've studied these systems all over the world. What are your thoughts on whether actually there's sort of, a case out there that these systems are sort of better or worse at sort of fending off the rise of illiberal populist authoritarianism? Yeah.
First point, nothing on the menu is an absolute protection against dysfunction, right? Dysfunction is ubiquitous. So we'll start with that. But I think, when I think about your question, I'll try to separate this between what are the ideals, so liberal democratic ideals that we're aspiring to when we set up rules for our elections, and what are the risks we want to hedge against. And so, in terms of, in that first category, under set of ideals, I think the first one is touching on what Drew raised, is all these societies, there's immense diversity in all these societies, and we want a system that represents diversity. Okay, so that's first thing, and I think the multi-winner systems, I think just intuitively offer a vehicle for doing that, even within the district. Another ideal that we want to aspire to is accountability of our representatives. And this can be individual accountability. We want to give voters like the idea of being able to reward or punish their representatives for good or bad behavior or performance. And there's a tension that we might think about between the ability to reward and punish individual politicians and the ability to reward and punish parties or coalitions. And we can talk about that. There are trade-offs there. one of the other, if we're thinking about broad principles that we want to aspire to, and I think this is a really important one, I'll call it legibility to the voters, right? We want a system where, from the voter's perspective, the connection between how they cast their ballot and what they end up with in terms of government or representation all the way down to policy is transparent, that they can make sense of it. And again, there are going to be trade-offs there across different electoral systems. But in general, I favor really prioritizing simplicity on that count. And then the last big ideal that I'll put out there for consideration is I think we want a system that's going to yield at the end policy that's more or less toward the center of the distribution of citizen preferences, right? There's always an array of citizen preferences out there, and I tend to prefer an electoral system that's going to avoid extremist outcomes. So those are the big principles I think we need to be thinking about. And then with risks, I'll have a shorter list, but only a little shorter. One is you want a system that's going to avoid what political scientists would call Condorcet losers, and by that I just mean electing somebody who's opposed by the majority of the population, because there are election systems, and we live under one of them, that can quite frequently produce losers as the electoral winner. So you want to avoid that. Relatedly, you want to avoid a system where the losing party or candidate can win the election. And again, we live under an electoral system where that's quite possible. It doesn't happen all the time, doesn't usually happen, but when it happens, I think that's a violation of the principle that all votes count equally. So we want to avoid that. And then I think we also want to avoid a system that really fosters polarization. And these are overlapping risks. So I'll close by saying single winner systems, as a rule, are systematically more inclined toward those risks that I've just outlined for two reasons. One, because when you draw up district boundaries and you have a bunch of elections that take place independently from each other in a single winner system, the geographical distribution of where votes are can matter just as much as the overall levels of support for candidates and parties. Okay, so when geographical distribution matters, you open yourself up to the possibility of Condorcet losers and of inversions. And the other thing is that when you have a single winner system, there's really an imperative to winnow the set of choices in the general election further than in a multi-winner system, right? A general election in a single winner system only can make sense to people if you really eliminate a lot of options before you present them in a general election. But that sequential elimination of candidates can open you up to ending up with a set, whether it's 2 or 3 or a handful, where the only options may be Condorcet losers. And so those two things, those are not just descriptions of where we are in 2024 in the United States, although they do describe where we are this year pretty well. But they're more broadly systematic to single winner systems. And so that to me is a compelling argument to consider alternatives.
Tova, did you want to
Yeah,
jump
I was
in there?
just going to mention that something that John alluded to about the geographic density being so determinative as being a major reason why people believe that a PR system would be better in terms of representation for communities of color, because it would not be conditioned on them being geographically concentrated, and you wouldn't get into the this gerrymandering craziness and so on that we had today. And so I think that's a strong argument, and I think we don't know probably exactly how that would play out in the United States, but I think that seems fair to imagine.
And Drew, I want to bring you into this as well. John's kind of, I think, laid out a compelling sort of justification for some of these alternative systems on the basis of sort of thematic values where they might align with liberalism. But when you actually talk about sort of practically out in the world, do you want to talk a little bit about are there good cases to be made that one or other of these systems are actually functionally better for preserving liberalism and actually how they play out in different countries?
Yeah, one place we can look to answer that question is what happens in countries when an illiberal force takes over. So a really good example here is the illiberal democracy in Hungary, where when Orban's party took power, one of the very first things they did is they took their mixed system, combination of single member districts and proportional representation, and they made the legislature as a whole smaller, and then they increased the proportion of single member districts compared to the proportion of proportional representation seats. Frankly, they made the system more like the one we have in the United States. So, and that makes sense when you think about it, because proportional representation requires collaboration of a large majority in order to hold power. But kind of a quintessential feature of autocrats and autocracy is that it relies on a small coalition of power, either so small that the autocrat can control them with bribery and threats, or a substantial minority of the population that can be manipulated by stoking fears about immigration or racial differences or religious differences or what have you. That sort of politics is rewarded in a single member system where you often have a two-party system, so you can take over one party and the only choice they have is to go to the other party. Very difficult in a polarized environment where people have serious policy differences with the opposite party. And a proportional system has the complete opposite dynamic. Instead of a small coalition, it's sort of intrinsic to the system that it's everyone. The whole idea is proportional representation is full representation. Instead of one group of people winning and everyone else losing, everybody wins, just in proportion to their numbers. Very, very difficult for an autocrat to manage such a system. And so it's not surprising that when we see autocrats start to gain power in places where there's some kind of combination of proportional representation and winner-take-all, they tend to exaggerate the winner-take-all aspects of the electoral system. It's very dangerous, I think, for us to be maintaining a winner-take-all system under that kind of environment.
Yeah, and I wonder if there's also another dynamic that sometimes plays out, that if you accept that in any liberal pluralistic society, you're probably going to have some fairly extremist faction that might be a liberal or, have very sort of retrograde kind of views on liberal concepts like equality. And that over time, that faction is going to rise and fall in terms of its size and its hold. So at low periods, it might hold. If you think about something like the Alternative for Germany party, might be 7% in low periods, but then in higher periods, it rises to 14, 15, or now somewhere up in maybe 27, pushing 30. And those things fluctuate. And you see that in countries like Austria, countries like France, countries like Germany. In these proportional systems, an interesting dynamic seems to take place where when they are on the smallest end, they essentially can't become really meaningful parts of a parliamentary coalition. They can essentially be locked out by the mainstream parties who make a decision that they're sort of anti-system, anti-democracy, anti-liberal, and we're not going to allow them into a coalition. But as they rise, right, they put this pressure on, whether they're coming from the left or the right, on the mainstream sort of center-right or center-left party about whether they're going to work with them or not. And one of the things I think we've seen happen is if at some point the mainstream center-right party agrees to form coalition, let's say with one of these parties that rises to get 25%, starts being a meaningful part of the legislature, that far-right party is forced into a choice. If it joins the governing coalition and begins to govern, which requires some amount of pragmatism and some amount of cooperation and some amount of sort of moderating its view in order to be part of this governing coalition, it alienates the base that originally elected it. In the next election, its proportion tends to go down. We've seen that happen in Austria and a couple of other places. On the other hand, if it strives to keep its base that got it there, it becomes a non-functional partner in the governing coalition and ultimately gets forced out of the coalition. And so in that way, those systems tend to moderate the ability of those extremist factions from essentially becoming dominant governing parties. Whereas in a system like ours, I would argue, we've had an illiberal authoritarian faction like that essentially capture the mainstream center-right party in this country to a great extent, because that dynamic didn't exist. It actually could come in and there was only one choice. We've now got a binary choice between the two. So in addition to the things you mentioned, there may be other reasons why these systems could be more resilient, John, to your point, against extremism and sort of forcing a bit more of compromise and moderation towards the center. But Tova, I want to talk about another aspect of this, which is that, regardless of which of these systems we choose, if you just look at a place like the United States, before you get to how a state or a municipality will decide how to translate popular will into a governing majority, the popular will is determined by votes. And obviously, in this country, we've had a pretty ugly history of trying to simply prevent people from voting to begin with. And so talk a little bit about that aspect of this, which is what are the ways that we might think about this that address this problem of whatever system you have. If there are people who want to block others from voting, that is fundamentally going to be an illiberal, undemocratic system. And what are ways we might think about addressing that problem?
Yeah, I mean, right, exactly. We can't have a politics or a political system based on exclusion, which arguably has been the thread that's run through our entire history. And we still need to think about that. It's not just the exclusion of people who are skeptics, perhaps on the right, or people who feel that they're being silenced on the right, but obviously the well-founded concerns and skepticism of communities of color, Native Americans, and others who have a good reason to feel that they're not being listened to, represented, and are being intentionally excluded at times. And I think that there are a lot of ways to get at that. I mean, but fundamentally, you're going to have huge numbers of people who have negative views of democracy. Why wouldn't they? I would kind of include in that, not for as structural reasons, but right now, young people who feel completely unlistened to for a bunch of reasons and unrepresented and are turning off the system. And that means we're going to be in really big trouble. If you think about a person who is 20 years old right now and what they've experienced as U.S. government and politics. So it's not just, sort of systemic stuff, but the environment that we find ourselves that can also lead to suppression of vote. I could come up with a million different ways and I have over the years to fight against voter suppression and to increase participation, including among excluded groups. And I continue to fully champion all of that. I think one thing that is critical to the entire conversation is that in any time that you think about making big change or changing structures or systems, that we bring people into the conversation. And by that, I mean organizers, advocates, practitioners, people who are actually in the field and actually in community with people to understand how these things will really impact them and whether that will be something where they feel more included. I fully understand all the arguments that are made that PR will do a lot of that and make people feel like their voices are more heard. And I think that's entirely possible. But again, I come at this from a perspective of we have to have a system that feels truly inclusive, cannot be based on exclusion, and represents values that we want to promote in the United States. And I think that has to be with the voices of young people and communities of color and low-income people who very rightfully feel aggrieved. And the channel is often now on the far right to air those grievances. I'll go back to what I said about the labor movement, and I don't mean to ramble, but I mean, I think that if there was a stronger labor movement, maybe that's reform of labor law, maybe that's a lot of things, it would not only address economic inequality in many ways, so you would have some of the temperature lowered that way, but you would have a more productive channel for people to have their economic grievances heard and listened to. And so it would both be something that would put people in community as working people, perhaps, rather than going in another direction, at the same time as actually doing something about the extreme inequality in the United States that I think leads to a lot of this anger and negativity, which, in many ways is understandable. So I think, given that your question relies on the assumption that we have had a tremendous amount of exclusion of many communities in this country, and that a lot of the voter suppression has been rooted usually in racism and anti-immigrant more and more views that again we need that is unsustainable for a liberal democracy, and that again we need to find a system that supports having the multiracial, diverse, multi-ethnic society that we have already and will only have more of in the days, months, years, decades to come.
One observation on that point that I would just point people to is in their book, How Democracies Die, Daniel Ziblatt and Steve Levitsky make an argument that really there has not been a successful, pluralistic, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious democracy that has sustained itself over any period of time. And the assumption, has been, well, is the United States, could it be that? Is it trending towards that? And the argument I think they make is that to the extent we've ever had one, it really only came about after the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 and lasted very few decades before we hit the crisis we're in today. And that is probably not coincidental.
So that's an interesting point, because I was going to raise anyway the work of my friend and colleague Guy Charles, who's a professor at Harvard Law School, who I admire a great deal. And he talks about how if we haven't lost the Voting Rights Act already, we're going to real soon. And so what is the new paradigm through which we understand ensuring representation and voting rights for communities of color, and it not being really binary anymore, that we really are in a multiracial society now, that the paradigm ought to shift a little bit anyway, and that perhaps things like PR are the next level Voting Rights Act, because regardless of whether you think the Voting Rights Act no longer works or not, we have lost most of it and we'll probably lose all of it. So what is the next paradigm through which we look at a new way of, or a new pathway to a Voting Rights Act of sorts?
So this is a conference on liberalism and the celebration of a plurality of ideas and diversity of views. And we've just completed most of this panel with a rousing, cheerleading, one-sided argument for moving to proportional representation.
Yeah.
So to invoke Bill Galston's excellent Robert Frost quote about how maybe we should try to argue against ourselves, let me ask this. Does someone want to offer the best counter-argument? So what is the strongest counter-argument against this push for PR and in defense of something like a first-past-the-post single-member district? John, take the charge. There you go. Good liberal.
Yeah. Doing my part. Look, let's imagine we made the move in the United States and we end up with, 4 or 5, 6 parties, none of which has majority support, commands majority support. And then, making decisions is going to be a function of coalition building from then on. But what's going to be difficult from a voter's perspective is, what if you really want to throw all the bums out? What if you just, you're really dissatisfied with the product that you're getting for the past 2 years or 4 years? It can be harder, because the choice, these sort of categorical choices tend to be sliced more finely under what tends to go in hand with proportional systems is multi-party systems. And so it's harder to throw all the bums out when there's a bunch of little units like that. And so I think that's a compelling case against the move that we've all seeming to be lining up behind. And that's been, I think that's the most compelling argument that advocates of single winner systems make, which is that what you want to do is have a clear government and a clear opposition, and whenever it is that you come around to getting elections, you want to give voters the choice between those two things. So one thing I will do is, again, now to try to split the difference, is to see, so far we've all been making, I think, arguments in favor of some kind of proportionality, some kind of multi-winner system. But then the next question, if you really thought about that, was, well, what kind of system? Like, you had pointed to famous dysfunction under PR systems. So I'm going to think to the audience, going to ask you all, what's the country that first pops to mind when you think of dysfunction under proportional representation?
Israel.
Thank you. Right? Yes, and Israel, they've gone all the way. When I talked about, not having single winner districts, they just erased all the lines on the map, and the whole country is a single district. So there's no sub-districts within Israel. They have 120 members in their Knesset, and they're elected nationwide on these party lists. And so when you do that, and they're not the only ones, the Netherlands does this as well, tend to be smaller countries, but when you make the move, or if you make the move to a multiple winner system, you got to figure out how many winners. And one option is the whole legislature in a single basket. And I would really caution against that, right? And so then, okay, I'm going to introduce another political science term, which is district magnitude. That's just the number of winners in a given district where we have our elections. So Israel's 120. And if we went to full PR in the United States, we could imagine a U.S. House Representatives election with 435-member district. We don't want to go there. And I think actually we want to be much closer to the end of the scale where we are right now, which is, closer to 1 than to 435 in terms of district magnitude. And that's still going to require drawing some lines. But to one of Drew's earlier points, the potential for gerrymandering, the leverage you can get with your line drawing goes down precipitously once you get above 1. It just becomes way harder to gerrymander effectively. So I think actually we could gain the lion's share of the advantages of multi-winner systems by actually making a relatively modest move. And I'd keep the districts, in that neighborhood of 4 or 5 rather than 20 or 50 or 100 or 400. And one thing that will do is it'll give us probably a bit more proportionality. It'll give us a lot more proportionality. It'll give us a bit more multipartism, but it won't move us to a place, I hope, where from a voter's perspective, it becomes impossible to think about how do I go in and punish the current government? Because you want to keep that door open for voters. If they really dislike what they're getting, you want to give them a viable opposition, a viable alternative for how to replace what they've currently got.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, one thing you bring up that I think is really important is even if we all agreed that proportional representation was the future and we wanted it right now, there's a whole bunch of design decisions that go into what kind of proportional representation you're doing. And probably the thing that gives me the greatest pause is just wondering which of those are we going to pick? Are we going to pick the right ones? Are there going to be some sort of consequence to the one that we choose that we didn't expect? But we have a couple advantages in the United States. One is that we are, unfortunately, quite late to the game, but that gives us a lot of other prior examples out there in the rest of the world to look at. And the other is federalism. So right now we've got states and, you hear the phrase laboratories of democracy. Right now, we kind of have laboratories of autocracy as well, as states are pushing boundaries in the opposite direction. And that actually makes state-level proportional representation an option with some urgency to it, in my mind. A lot of the policy matters that are most important to people right now, is crime, education, reproductive rights, are now decided at the state level. And having something fair at the state level can both be very important, and it gives us an opportunity to actually see some of these design decisions in practice. So states, lots of states have the initiative, states can experiment, and states have started experimenting, with Maine going to ranked choice voting, Alaska adopting its model, but no state yet has made the plunge and tried proportional representation.
Yeah.
But I think it's close at hand. I expect that we'll start to see something about that sometime soon.
I'll just plus one looking at states and also cities. I believe Portland, Oregon has started down the path of implementing a PR system. I think it's been a struggle, but I think they're getting there. I mean, I guess my critique would be that it's just woefully insufficient, which I think maybe is to state the obvious. You touched upon the Electoral College. If you want to look at how people feel excluded, look no farther than, a handful of states being the ones that decide who the president is and everybody else feeling like they have no voice. And so that right there is an enormous part of this. And there are many ways. We just had a conference that did include organizers and advocates and election administrators, as well as scholars, to look at all the different ways you might get past the Electoral College. And then, beyond the cultural issues as well, there are other parts of the system I might raise the Supreme Court. And I don't have a strong view on how to go about reform of the Supreme Court or what to do about the Supreme Court, but what are the ways in which, what does structure do for what's going on, not just actually at the Supreme Court, but at many levels of the court system? So I guess it's a path, but certainly, not the only thing we need to be thinking about.
Well, as we think about some of these issues, the next question that arises is, okay, once you determine that you might want to move in a different direction, say just, Drew, at the state level, getting there is a whole other challenge. And so just open it up to any of you that want to speak to this. Are there any lessons that we can draw from around the world on just how you actually move one of these reforms from a panel to actual implementation in the world?
I think there the challenge is really heightened. If we think about how most countries that are currently in PR or multi-winner systems got there, the big So the big move was early 20th century as countries expanded the franchise. And you could think of PR, and there's a huge academic literature about this, and there's debates. So I'm going to be doing violation to all kinds of subtle arguments. But I think one of the central conclusions is PR became a way of hedging bets. And in particular, when there was a sort of envisioning the enfranchisement of a big labor movement, or sort of of the working class in a lot of countries that had previously been disenfranchised, the idea among the currently dominant parties was, holy cow, if we were at a single winner system, we're going to be the single losers every single time from now on. So some kind of proportional multi-winner system is going to be our way of hedging our bets and ensuring that we don't get completely wiped off the map. But now most countries have a pretty wide franchise, and so there isn't that that path to reform. I don't see that as being available to us. And I think I'm going to put this back to Drew in a minute, because I know he's thought much more about this at the state level. But my concern is that one of the big impediments is, most of the politicians and activists and so forth that I talk to that are interested in this idea tend to be on the Democratic side. But it can look like unilateral disarmament if you were to do this at the state level, right? Because right now we've got some states where the Democrats get the big winners bonus, and other states where the Republicans get the big winners bonus. And if some states started to do this piecemeal, and they were all Democratic states, what they'd all be doing is sacrificing their winners bonus in the states. In Massachusetts, they'd go from owning all the representation to owning 65% of it. But what good is that if you're not going to have matching, sort of offsetting disarmament on the other side? And so I think Drew's thought hard about this, and I'm curious to hear his.
I just want to interject a real question. So do you have the same concerns if you do it at the local and city level, or is that the place for experimentation then? Or I would put that to Drew as well. I really just don't know.
Yeah, there has been more experimentation at the city level, but I think in those environments, they tend to be, a lot of times, they're nonpartisan elections. I think of like the city council in Cambridge, right?
I know it well.
Yeah, right. Which is elected by single transferable vote, by the way, just to circle back to one of my favorites from earlier on. But I think you should hear about from Drew.
Or Portland, you mentioned earlier. I don't think people are too worried about Republicans winning seats on the
But
Portland
maybe
City
that's a
Council.
better environment in which to experiment. Where it's the temperature is lower.
Yeah, I do expect states that are very heavily Republican or very heavily Democratic to be the first places where there are opportunities. So, and it might be places we don't expect. So you can look at a state like Arkansas, right, which is heavily Republican. But they have this history of electing their state legislature through counties. This is something that a lot of states had. They used to elect their state houses on a county basis. This was inconsistent with the one-person, one-vote cases. So most of those states wound up going to single-member districts. But if you read the Arkansas Constitution today, it still says that the legislature is elected on a county basis. They just never revised it. They just ignore it. There's an argument there that's kind of a conservative argument, right? That we could go back to this way of electing multiple members on a county basis in a way that's consistent with one person, one vote, in a way that's consistent with the Voting Rights Act, by adopting a form of proportional representation. And yes, more Democrats would get elected in Arkansas if Arkansas were to make that shift. But it would go from like 90% to like 80%. Like I just don't think it would be quite as threatening. Even still, it might be a challenge to get it through the legislature, but a lot of these states have initiative rights. So voters can get things through on their own. Illinois used a semi-proportional system. It used to use 3-member districts with cumulative voting, which is not a party list system, and not single transferable vote, just a system that guarantees some level of minority representation. And it adopted it in 1870, right after the Civil War, when Illinois was highly polarized between Northern Republicans and Southern Democrats. And as a result of using this cumulative voting system, well into the 1970s, until 1980, when it repealed it, you would have Republicans elected in urban centers in Chicago and Cook County. You'd have Democrats elected downstate. Unfortunately, it was repealed as part of a measure that was largely sold as, you mentioned, kicking out the bums. They shrunk the size of their legislature by 1/3, and that was the thing people actually liked about the proposal. Cumulative voting itself was very popular in Illinois. Since then, there have been occasional calls to bring it back, but anyone who knows Illinois politics might recognize the date 1980 as right around when Mike Madigan kind of took control of the state and held it until a couple years ago. But now that that like machine has been changed, there may be an opportunity in a state like Illinois to return. You know, these arguments they go beyond the simple like partisan arguments. They're arguments grounded in history and benefits that states have gotten historically from systems like this.
Mm-hmm. So before we open it up for questions, there was one other thing that we were going to talk about, but in the spirit of opening up for questions, I'm just going to make a plea on this last point, which is that, so this has been actually a remarkably agreeable panel on reforms. Now, if you spend your time in this world, most panels on electoral system reform are not nearly this agreeable. There's a lot of different perspectives on what should be done. And one of the risks of that I've always feared is that the reform movement will essentially end up in a war with itself, and that war will end up hampering the overall ability of the reform movement to push forward with any sort of change. And so one of the things that I would encourage us to be when it comes to these sorts of reforms is pansexual about them, which is we should be into all of them. We're in a moment of crisis right now. The system is not working, and it needs some change, and it needs some experimentation. And what I wouldn't want us to fall into, those of us who believe that some reform is needed, is what is known as sort of the narcissism of small differences. And so, yes, we obviously want to be thoughtful about making sure that we don't break things. I'm not advocating for a Facebook-style motto on our democracy. And we want to make educated and informed judgments and thoughtful research judgments about what things might happen, but we should be careful that we don't end up in such a war with ourselves that we break sort of what could be a coalition for reform. And on that point...
I'd just like to clarify on that point, too, speaking for, what I believe. I don't know what the answer is, right? I'm not in the tank for PR. I think it sounds good, but, I don't pretend to be an expert. I'm just, I think you're right. We need to think expansively, and I'm sorry to keep repeating myself. I have to name check again. I've learned so much from Hari Khan about this over the last 10 years or so, about the need to invest and speak with and negotiate and engage with base building organizations that are truly rooted in communities to know what some of these answers are, and they may have some ideas that we don't. They know what's going on out there. So that would be my plea.
Yeah, I'm glad you added that, because I think part of what to me underlies the narcissism of small differences point is a point about humility, which is that for all of the great thinking that anyone might do on what reform might produce, none of us know for sure. And I would point to the sort of campaign finance reform movements of the early 2000s that were convinced that the solution for saving democracy was broad-based small dollar donations, which are now the engine that is fueling Marjorie Taylor Greene's rise in politics, right? So you just never know what you're going to get. And so we should be careful that we should have the humility of not knowing exactly what will be produced. But I think that the underlying point is we also want to make sure that we hold the democracy or the democracy reform coalition together. Maybe I'll sort of end on this point before opening it up, which is we held a summit on democracy, our organization with several others back in 2017, where we invited, like today, a group of people who had been battling illiberal authoritarian movements around the world to offer advice to all of us here in the United States for what we were about to be entering into in this era starting in 2017. And the opposition minister from Poland, Agnieszka Pomaska, when we asked her what's the one piece of advice she had for Americans entering this period, she said, don't let the pro-democracy coalition fracture. And that was a lesson learned from hard experience in Poland, where, as a result of a lot of the stuff that we're talking about today, the Law and Justice Party had largely risen to power on plurality support, not majority support. The same is true with Fidesz in Hungary, and the same is famously true with the Nazi Party in Germany, which never achieved a majority in any election. It was the system design choices that those countries made that translated extremist minority pluralities into powerful governing majority. So those are the stakes on this. And for us to survive that, we need to make sure that the pro-democracy, pro-liberalism coalition stays united as it did in Poland, which is what ultimately led to the win there. And I would argue that it was enabled to do that by some of the structures of the Polish system that make it a little bit more challenging here in the United States. Because one of the most disenfranchised factions in the United States today on these systems are sort of traditional mainstream conservative Republicans who are neither Democrats nor identify with the current incarnation of the Republican Party, and yet negative polarization does create barriers to them pulling the lever for a party that they don't identify with and agree with. And that's another argument for why sort of systems that provide more choices, options, items on the menu might actually empower us to protect a more liberal and more democratic form of government. Okay, so with that, we're going to open up for some questions. Wait for the mic, and the first hand I saw was over there, so why don't we go over there and just wait for the mic, and if you could just tell us a little bit about where you're coming from, that would be great. Okay.
Yeah. Hi there. Ishan Tharoor, I'm a columnist of the Washington Post. Just two quick questions.
Hold the mic a little closer. So
Sorry, two quick questions. I'm Ishan, I'm of the Washington Post. For those on the panel who are more clear or sanguine about their support for PR, I'm curious what you think. You know, after Labour's pretty interesting victory, given that they only won a third of the votes and have 2/3 of the seats, there have been calls within the British left, as such as it is, for Labour to seriously consider PR reforms, even though a PR system would automatically catapult the left, center-left out of power. I'm curious whether you think, for the sake of liberalism, for the sake of sort of center-left values, Labour should go ahead with some kind of conversation or movement on PR in the UK. And then my second question, I guess it's kind of a chicken or the egg question, is, you know, one of the glaring issues in this country, especially when you hold it up comparatively, is the absence of a multi-party democracy. And do you have a more representative system, a kind of mixed or a PR system that can be enabled here only after you can have a more robust multi-party democracy, or do you get the multi-party democracy once you have a more mixed representative system?
so want to take any of this?
I can start. Responding to your question about the UK, it's very difficult to know. A lot of people did this after both the UK and French elections of saying, what if they used PR? Here's what the results would have been. But it's always very difficult to know what the strategies would have been. Both of those elections included a lot of intense strategizing around the systems they were operating under. So Labour's exaggerated vote share compared to prior elections, where it might have gotten greater vote shares but still lost, is the result of very careful coordination around which districts they were going to run seriously in, and which districts parties like the Lib Dems were going to run seriously in. So I'm not convinced that a switch to PR would result in the kinds of projections that people have been making as a result in the UK. Likewise in France. But forgive me, what was the second question?
Second question was about the sort of pathway towards multi-partyism. Is that right?
Oh, the multi-partyism. Yeah, it is the case that most places that adopted proportional representation already had multi-party systems. It's the case that most countries have multi-party systems, even if they aren't using proportional representation. The UK and France being examples, but the United States. So there's a model, the C product model, for estimating how many parties you expect a country to have participating in its legislature, and the United States should have a bunch. It should have like 6 parties in its House of Representatives, but it doesn't. So things are suppressing multi-partyism in the United States beyond just the use of single-member districts. And I don't have a direct answer to this, but that suggests that some sort of change could unlock multi-partyism in the United States, and we'd see a very rapid shift to a multi-party system.
Drew, are there any organizations working on ways to unlock that problem? So that was a softball for me, so I'm going to take that softball. So one of the reasons why we have a two-party locked system in this country is because of what are known as bans on fusion voting. So fusion voting was a practice that was very common in the 19th century and before in the United States. And what fusion voting is where multiple parties can form multiple parties could potentially even nominate the same person. And then, so for example, go back to sort of the 1840s, 1850s, you have a problem in this country where as abolition starts rising in the North, abolitionists say, well, we don't want to be Democrats because Democrats are pro-slavery in the South, but we don't really want to be Whigs either because Whigs aren't exactly anti-slavery, they're running pro-slavery candidates in the South. And so Garrison's answer to that is screw it all. Burn the whole thing down. The whole system's corrupt. And Douglas says, that's all well and good, sir, but actually, I think we should try to win some elections, right? And so Douglas's idea is, well, we should create smaller parties that are, committed to some of the different flavors of abolition that exist. So for those who are absolutely for abolishing slavery outright, they form the Liberty Party. And the Liberty Party gathers people who are anti-slavery, want to abolish it, and says to the Whigs, if you nominate somebody that is with us and is anti-slavery, we will take our 50,000 or our 100,000 members of the Liberty Party, and we will nominate that person as well, and they'll get our votes as well. And they do that in Ohio to elect Salmon Chase, and they do that in Massachusetts to elect Charles Sumner. But then there are some people who say, well, we don't really want to abolish slavery in the South. We just don't want to extend it into the territories. No problem. They create the Free Soil Party, which represents that view. And the Free Soil Party makes the same argument to the Whigs. And eventually, the Whigs start nominating people to try to capture the energy that is behind each of these smaller parties. And so you get candidates who show up on the ballot 3 times as the nominee of the Whig Party, as the nominee of the Liberty Party, as the nominee of the Free Soil Party, sometimes as the nominee of the Know Nothing Party. And then they take all the votes they get on each other's lines and they fuse them together. Right? And eventually, that powerful dynamic puts such pressure on the Whigs that the Whigs start to weaken, and all those other parties realize that they've actually got some energy behind them, some people behind them. So they go to a meeting in Ripon, Wisconsin, and they join forces. They form the Republican Party. But then the Republican Party, after winning a fusion election with Abraham Lincoln on the ticket, who wins a fusion candidacy, decides it doesn't like this anymore because it realizes that it is fighting urban Catholics in the cities in the East, and it is fighting Protestant farmers in the countryside in the West, and they're uniting against the Republican Party. The Republican Party says, I don't like them uniting. Let's ban fusion, make them form their own parties, and fight as weaker parties. So the Republicans ban fusion in the North, the Democrats ban fusion in the South. It stays legal in basically 2 states, New York and Connecticut. And today, if you are, for example, a traditional mainstream Republican conservative in, Kansas, and you're not a Democrat, but you don't like the direction of the Republican Party, and you want to form your own party and nominate the same person being nominated by one of the other parties, you can't do that. It's illegal. So yesterday, yesterday, we filed suit in Kansas to challenge that as a violation of the Kansas Constitution. We filed the same suit in New Jersey. We're going to file it in several other states. But to answer the question, one of the reasons is because if these small parties could actually form and not be spoilers, right? We're not talking about RFK Jr. here, but actually nominate one of the mainstream candidates, then they can begin to organize. And once they organize under the banner of, I think in Kansas it's called United Kansas, in New Jersey it's called the Moderate Party, in Michigan it's called the Common Sense Party, well, then you've got an organized constituency that is a third party that has some power and not as a spoiler, and can then organize for some of these reforms. So it's a way of introducing multipartyism. Thank you for teeing that up. That was not planned, but that was perfect. Yes, let's go over here.
Thank you. Joe Bishop Henchman, former national chair of the Libertarian Party before it was taken over by the alt-right. So
Someone got something about this topic.
got a lot to say, but I'm an audience member, not a panelist, so I'll ask another question about the UK. About a dozen years ago, the UK had a referendum on an electoral reform. I know that some of the subnational entities like the European Parliament and Scottish Parliament don't use the first past the post. What lessons should we learn from the failure of that referendum? Rather decisive, I think it was like 2-1, and from their experience with the Scottish Parliament, which I guess they like because they still keep it. Thank you.
John, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'll take that. Actually, I was going to come back to that with respect to the last question as well. If you recall, I think the Lib Dems had for ages been saying if we ever get into government, first thing we're going to do is have a referendum on changing the electoral system, because the Lib Dems have been perennially sort of shortchanged by the first past the post system in the UK. And so this was, but in that election where they finally kind of won enough seats to get themselves in, all of a sudden their fervor for proportional representation cooled considerably. They had been promising forever to hold this, and they went forward with it, but they really didn't work for it the way that a party so long committed to changing the election system, you might have thought they would. And I think the reason that their fervor cooled so much, and they probably regret that now, but the reason was that it is just really hard to get politicians who just won under a given set of rules to advocate changing those set of rules. This is, there are very few universalisms in social science, but I think that might be one of them. If you just won with a given set of rules, you like them. And they tend, I think in the Lib Dems case, they tend to overestimate their future prospects under that set of rules. So one, implication I think of this for, if we think about prospects for reform, the road ahead in the United States, is that our best bet are going to be states where there's an initiative process, a ballot initiative process. And that's only about half of our states. And I know, turn it back to Drew, which I keep doing for the good answers here. But that means the places we should be looking first are places where you can take that option out of the hands of the legislatures and put it in the hands of the citizens. And, I could go in a number of different directions about my distrust of citizen initiatives in a lot of cases, but on this one policy issue, I think it's probably our best bet. So.
Sure. Yeah. And yes, Scotland, I believe Northern Ireland and Wales also use proportional representation, but has not been adopted at the national level there. So that's perhaps a lesson in the limits of subnational reform. Does not necessarily bubble up, but hopefully makes a dent in it. But yeah, there are about half of states. In fact, just yesterday, there was a decision out of the Utah Supreme Court that people can't, if something passes by initiative in Utah, the legislature can't immediately repeal it. Because that's something we've seen a lot of pushback against the initiative process itself, in part because citizens are starting to use it to reform their legislatures. So it's both a good sign and a bad sign that we're seeing that pushback. A small victory from Utah yesterday, and there are some states that allow initiative, a smaller subset within that allow really binding initiatives, like the decision out of Utah supported in that state. And a lot of complexity to these kinds of issues, but also a lot of people up to the challenge.
This is a little bit of a question as well as trying to add something, but it occurs to me as you were talking about the UK and France, how much of this was the pro-democracy across spectrum coalition and the strategy and the strategic hanging together that they did a part of the story as much of the actual structure. And we had the first past the post system, right? Can we replicate? I think that's the purpose we're all sitting here for, is replicate that broad across the spectrum pro-democracy hanging together for the greater good. And are there lessons that we can take from that, the structures notwithstanding?
Right. Of course, in France, the Popular Front and the Macronists coordinated with each other to make sure that they were not splitting the vote in order to beat National Rally. All right, let's maybe take a couple of these. Okay, so we'll go front row over here, and then maybe we'll do on the aisle right there. So one and then two. We'll take two.
Atul Singh, I'm the founder of Fair Observer, which is an independent journal on world affairs, and we publish perspectives from around the world, over 3,000 actually, from 90 countries. So I lived in the UK many years. My editing team is largely still in London, followed this election very closely. Lots of friends in different parties ran. And one of the points which a Danish friend points out, and this is the form versus substance argument, points out the UK has the first past the post system. And people are happy with it because the English like precedent. The Anglo-Saxon system of common law is all about precedent. And they vote accordingly to your answer. Okay. And this time, of course, reform had 15% of the vote. And they vote accordingly, and you can still vote out people, including powerful politicians like Margaret Thatcher and Boris Johnson. He said, in our system, this is my Danish friend saying, in our system, as in the Danish system with proportional representation, he said the two big risks that happen is that the party leadership becomes extremely important. So the MPs have no spine. They have to suck up to the big bosses of the party. And that's dangerous. You lose that questioning ability. And two, he said, you take out that individual relationship which you have in the UK between the member of parliament and the constituent, the surgeries that they do. the problems they raise for their constituents with various departments of government. And he said, in the Danish parliament, we are seeing that breakdown of that individual relationship. So the idea of a precedent is important. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have proportional representation in this country and other countries. And of course, I won't talk about Israel. That's a can of worms. We'll park it there. There, steadily, Bibi Netanyahu has drifted right. And now there is a veto over government policy by the far right. So as you said, be careful of what you choose from. And what do you think about the risks in the American context? Have you thought deeply enough about that? Thank you very much.
That is the critique of PR, that you lose that individual relationship with the constituents a lot of the time, right? I mean, if that really exists, I don't know anymore.
Yeah, I'm happy to, can I jump in a
Yeah,
little?
go for it. Go for it. Then
we
we're
wanna
going
take
to
both?
come back over there in a minute. Yeah, why don't we just take one more and then we'll jump in. The gentleman on the aisle right there. Yeah. Just wait for a microphone. It's coming over.
The panel has admirably described general principles which would apply worldwide, et cetera, but in the background there's also been concern about the United States in particular. And I think at the risk of narrowing it to the latter, one thing which you have not discussed, and which is a core of the problem we have here, is candidate selection. Before you get to these electoral systems, and we have got the worst candidate selection process that we could have. It violates the principle, which was one of the main principles John announced, namely of trying to avoid extremism and concentrating on having a majority, the will of a majority come through. And what we have is a primary system in which the participation is a lot less than it will be in the general election. The people most likely to vote are the most disaffected. Those are not likely to be in the middle, not to mention the many states in which the center is excluded because only registered party members can vote. All of these lead to a great polarization, and it's a centrifugal system as opposed to the centripetal system you had when party bosses wanted to win and therefore had to aim a bit at the middle. So all of this was predictable. Namely, the minute that primary system was increased in 1968, all these disadvantages were perfectly predictable. It was a case of what consequences which should have been intended, but which were unintended consequences because people didn't have enough foresight. That raises the more general question of unintended consequences of all other things. Like, for example, proportional representation. You have excessive weight on the minorities because they may be needed to form coalitions. Israel being the extreme case, but not the only case, in which you have unintended consequences coming in. In this case, a greater weight to minorities who have to form, since the major parties may have to form coalitions in a multi-party system, et cetera. So the more general thing is how careful one has to be about these general principles. And for example, you have to take the cases of individual countries or the populace that you're working with more seriously than is perhaps reached by general principles. So, I mean, this is a scattering of things, but enough that one may want to get some answers to.
We could take either of those. So who would like to take either? But John, you're about to go.
I'll try hard to touch on both of them. And I'll start again with a general principle, which is it is trade-offs all the way down, right? It just is. And I articulated a bunch of principles that I want an election system to aspire to. Some of those are going to be in contradiction with each other. Let me talk a little bit about some of the trade-offs, especially one that was touched on at the beginning here is this relative responsiveness of our representatives to the parties versus to voters in whatever districts they face. If we think, again, at the archetype at the other end of the spectrum, at the far end from us, the Israeli system, which is big districts, no, actually, the biggest district, the whole country, closed lists, right? So Israeli voters go and they just pick a party. They don't get to individually indicate a preference for a candidate. If you think about what that means then, the list might have 120 names on it, but there's plenty of parties that know they're going to win 10, 20, some odd, but they know they're not going to win 80 seats or much less 115. And so if you are in the top handful of candidates on that list, and that's decided by the bosses, you're good. You face no electoral risk, and if you're at number 60 or number 90, you have zero chance of being elected under any circumstance. So what that means is that in practice, you are entirely dependent on the people who make the list for your prospects professionally, right? That's gonna really concentrate sort of authority within the party bosses as opposed to the voters. Voters don't like these kinds of systems, and there's been a trend over the last 30 or 40 years toward opening up lists. But, okay, so what would that mean? Well, as a voter, the Israelis could say, we're gonna have an open list system. You get to pick your favorite candidate in your favorite party, right? But if the list had 120 names on it, and every voter who wants to go in and vote for Likud's picking their favorite, it means it's utter warfare among 120 people within each party, right? And so Brazil is actually pretty closely approximates this. They don't use nationwide districts, but in Sao Paulo, there's 70-something seats at stake in the election in Sao Paulo state, and that means there's about 50 parties that have a chance of winning one of them, and each one of them is running 70 candidates. And from voters' perspective, it's utter chaos, and also from the perspective of the candidates trying to campaign and win loyalty. So that is the other end of the spectrum, where the candidates are then in frantic war against their co-partisans, and they're not really listening much to the party leaders. So I hate to be like the guy with the hammer, but I am. The solution to this is smaller magnitude districts, right? Because as you move from single member districts to larger ones, the number of viable parties is going to expand, and the number of candidates within each party's list is going to expand, which means that as you increase magnitude, the potential for cacophony among individual candidates grows not arithmetically, but kind of geometrically, right? And that's a really compelling argument for keeping the size of the district, or the magnitude of the district, relatively low. At those low magnitudes, I think you can thread the needle between, sort of responsiveness by the candidates to the voters and considerable responsiveness to party leaders. But it's a needle you have to thread. It's a brutal trade-off, and there are countries that are on, sort of both sides of it egregiously at the wrong end of the spectrum. So.
Yeah, and I'll add, when it comes to member-constituent link, the current system is not actually all that great for it in the United States. An example, there are anecdotes coming out of, for example, Austin, Texas, where people frequently reached out to the sole Democratic representative representing Austin, but because of gerrymandering, most of the people in Austin lived in a safe Republican district that had cracked off bits of Austin in order to increase the overall Republican count. So that Democratic representative had to then direct them to the Republican representative who perhaps they did not feel comfortable going to with an issue with the healthcare system or with something else that they were trying to achieve with regard to a local concern in an urban environment with a representative who might be hostile to those interests. You can find a country where the member constituent link is so strong that people treat it as a problem. An example is Ireland, right? Ireland, 3, 4, and 5 member districts, single transferable vote, which is kind of the most candidate-centric form of proportional voting that there is. And friends and neighbors campaigning is so prevalent that people worry that national policy interests are being sacrificed in the interests of these candidates talking about how good a job they're going to do representing personal interests of the people that they represent. So these kinds of system designs can go different ways. And I think there's an argument to be made that the kind of modest proportional system that you're talking about could actually improve local representation in the United States compared to a single member district.
Tova, did you want to get in on that one? Or
you could
okay.
go.
To the gentleman over here, the former Congressman Barney Frank used to invoke his Jewish heritage, say, I'm going to answer your question with a question. And it is this, that in the political parties in the US 1.0, the sort of smoke-filled room, the sort of centrifugal force you described, they were good gatekeepers, but they were not really democratically legitimate, right? And so, as you note, the reform was to open up that nominating contest and create what I would describe as political parties 2.0 after the primary and caucus system gets introduced, which creates parties that, as you pointed out, are centripetal and that they are more democratically legitimate, but turns out not very good gatekeepers, right? which I think raises the question, what does political parties 3.0 look like that is both plays a gatekeeper function, but has some degree of democratic legitimacy? That is a question that I have not found a good answer to over the last 8 years that I've been asking to it. Our organization did a project with the American Political Science Association trying to answer that question. And we produced, I think, a really, really interesting document that you should take a look at. It's about 200 pages about sort of our system, and it still doesn't answer that question. And so I would ask that question back to the room. Political parties are an essential part of democracies. We can have a whole other panel about why they're necessary. Figuring out what political parties 3.0 looks like that solves both those problems is, to me, the political science question of the next couple of years for anyone who can answer it. Okay, we got a question back there, and then we'll go to the gentleman over here. So back there and then over here.
In Germany, we don't have a binary. We have both options. We have local representation, local districts, and we have proportional representation that balances out the total results of the election. So we get the best of both worlds. This, as you all know, was a compromise between American and British political scientists and constitutionalists who helped to create that system. Why isn't that the right system for the United States?
Take that one, and then a woman right there with her hand up. Yep, if you have the mic, and then we'll do those, and we'll see if we have time. Go ahead.
Hi. Yeah, so I mean, in the UK, we had that referendum rejecting electoral reform. We also have very low voter turnout. People don't care about the current system. They don't care about change. How would you sell it to the electorate as something they should get excited about if maybe they don't care about politics? Like, how would you make it sexy?
Either of those two.
Well, I can take the second one. I mean, I think that, and this is a challenge that, I mean, I've tried to contend with everybody I work with for years, is how do you make those connections between these reforms and people's daily lives and how it's impacting their lives, their pocketbook issues, how they navigate the world. And I think it's been really difficult to get that really strong, passionate movement for reform because people don't easily see the connection between their material needs and what they need as being fundamentally related to that. So I think that's always the challenge.
I'll tell a quick story, although it's going to be demoralizing, about how to make this exciting. I teach a class regularly. I used to call it electoral systems. And at the end of the term, a student came to me about 10 years ago and said, I only took this class because I didn't get into another one that I wanted, and this was the only thing that was available. And but you know what? I really liked it, and I would recommend take the word systems out of the title because I just didn't want to go anywhere near that. And I did, so I changed the name of the class to Elections and Reform, and enrollment doubled. But that's just a way of saying I am the wrong person to ask for any marketing advice, and it's hard to get people wildly excited about this kind of stuff. I wish I had a better answer.
There is an uplifting story recently here in the United States. So in Michigan, which had a very heavily gerrymandered legislature, a citizen who was not a politician, not a professional activist, so frustrated with the fact that politicians were essentially drawing the lines of their districts and picking their voters, wrote a Facebook post decrying the fact that these politicians were taking choice and decision-making out of the hands of voters. Her name was Katie Fahey. The post went viral, and she ended up being drafted into leading a citizen initiative that wildly successfully overturned the sort of system for line drawing in Michigan, and it was just a citizen engagement sort of uprising, suggesting that these sort of citizen initiatives can be ways of doing it, and also that this notion of who has power, is it us or is it some sort of politician, is a very, very effective frame. It's a citizen commission where it's a citizen commission that brings all people together and then uses computer scientists to sort of draw lines, et cetera. And then to the gentleman's question about why don't we just have a system like that? look, I think that gets to the point that John was making earlier, which, sort of Upton Sinclair's line about it's very difficult to get someone to understand something that their salary depends on them not understanding, which is when you win, you don't want to change the system, which is why another possible avenue for reform, leaning into someone earlier was invoking John Rawls' sort of a veil of ignorance test, is to have these reforms sunrise at a point in time after the current crop of elected politicians doesn't know how it will affect them. And so I'll just end on sort of a brief story of what could have been. I guess it's a little bit self-congratulatory, so forgive me for this. But in 2010, I was in the White House counsel's office. The president was about to give the State of the Union. It was a few days away, and Rahm Emanuel was the chief of staff at the time, and sent word down to our office that we needed something on gerrymandering in the State of the Union, and we needed a reform idea right away by 5 o'clock, which is how Rahm used to do things. No problem. We'll come up with a gerrymander reform for the president announced at 5 o'clock. Well, what we came up with very quickly was that we would actually have a bipartisan group, because President Bush had just written in his memoir that he thought solving the gerrymandering problem was one of the most important problems to solve in this country, of former President Bush and former President Clinton, sort of working with a bunch of electeds to come up with a solution to this problem, draft a piece of legislation, but this was the key, it would sunrise in 10 years. So nobody voting on it at the time would know whose ox would get gored. And Rahm was basically like, that's too creative and clunky. So it never went in. But that was 2010. And had something like that proceeded, because it seemed so far off in the future, that would have been ancient history at this point. And so maybe that is just sort of a pathway of what might have been in some Philip Roth alternative history. But there are avenues to do this if we have a coalition that is behind reform and realizes that we need something that's going to work better for the 21st century. So let me thank our wonderful panelists. Thank all of you. And of course, thank our host, and we'll turn it over to Dave.